Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about uh, organizations, teamwork, and communication. Okay, first let's start by talking about culture. So, like we have culture in a country, organizations themselves have their own culture. We call that organizational culture, not surprise. What we mean by organizational culture is the way actually companies uh, do things, right? So, what are their shared values, beliefs, traditions, and philosophies? How are things done differently in an organization versus another organization within the same industry? And there are quite a big set of differences, right? There are different ways of doing things, and this is what we're trying to capture with organizational culture. That has two different aspects: the formal side of culture, which is usually codified, meaning that it's written somewhere. So that includes things like the mission statement, what is the company trying to achieve overall, and the way decisions are made within the organization, and that it's encoded in things like the code of ethics that we have already discussed, but also other things like work manuals, right? So those are job descriptions that are gonna outline what is expected of different individuals within the organizations, etc., etc. So this is the more formal aspect of culture within an organization, but there is also an informal part. Okay, so when it comes down to informal culture, we're talking about things like the dress code, right? Are you expected to dress business casual, or is it a more formal environment where you are expected to wear a suit and a tie every day to work? So usually banks. Uh, Banks and law firms, they tend to be quite formal. Whereas tech companies used to have, no, they usually have dress codes that are a lot more lax. So you will see the CEO of the company just casually dressed in maybe slacks and a polo shirt, whereas in uh, whereas in a consulting firm, you're probably expected to wear much more formal clothes. Okay? And also, what kind of work habits are established, right? Is it okay to work from home? Do you need to actually be at your office, right? This is also part of the culture of, and what the expectations are within the organization, although a lot of these expectations might actually not be explicitly written, but everybody knows about them within the firm. Okay. And another than organizational culture that obviously permeates every activity that happens within the organization. A very important aspect of how the company is set up is the organizational structure. This is essentially the arrangement of the positions within the organization. So, who's doing what task and who reports to who. This is essentially the organigram within the firm. So, uh, structure, when we speak about structure, we're basically talking about work task assignment. So, who's going to be doing what particular task within the firm, and also how is information passed within those different positions? How is coordination actually happening? Okay, so it's about work tasks, it's about coordination, and it's about the flow of information. That's what we mean by structure within the organization. And one way of capturing all that structure is through organizational charts, which are basically a diagram or a visual representation of what organizational structure exists. So let's go through a couple of examples so that you can see it. So here you can see the evolution of a typical small firm in terms of their organizational structure. So initially what you're going to see in phase one, you have it here. And you have an extremely simple, in fact, the simplest organizational structure that it's possible. So you might only have the owner that is essentially conducting all tasks. So every responsibility and every decision is made by the same person, right? So this is the simplest form of organizational structure that you can have in a firm. And as the company uh, goes over time and maybe becomes somewhat successful, we move from phase one to phase two. And you can see how now the organization grows, and now you only don't have the owner, which you used to have before, but now maybe we have some sort of salesperson and maybe somebody who's in charge of buying the merchandise within the firm. So now you have a new organizational structure, and you have a new organigram that depicts how the firm actually it's going to report information and how the tasks are going to be assigned. So you have the owner at the top, and then from the owner you have two lines of authority that go to the two different functions that we observe, which will be sales and merchandise buying. Okay, and then obviously as the firm keeps getting bigger and maybe more successful over time, there's going to be more people that are added because just one person or maybe one department cannot fulfill all the jobs that were accomplished before. Okay, so now instead of having only a salesperson, you might have multiple salesperson, and because of that, now you have a sales manager, somebody who's managing the whole sales function because there is sufficient enough people that you need to coordinate, you need to direct, you need to assign tasks, and now the owner maybe cannot do all that. So now the owner is going to be talking to the sales manager mostly instead of to individually salespeople, and the sales manager is going to enable that coordination between people within the sales department, right? Maybe you still have the same merchandise buyer. Maybe the company is not big enough to require multiple people in this space. But now you start having here other people that provide services that maybe before were conducted by the owner. So maybe you have an accountant now that is in charge of keeping track of all the transitions within the firm. And maybe you might have somebody in charge of doing some analysis of what's happening with, I don't know, maybe consumer data, right? So as you can see, as the firm grows, the organizational structure is going to become more complex, right? Starting from the simplest situation where you only have one job and one job only, that in this case, one person that completes all jobs, to more specific jobs and how those are arranged, okay? And you can see it visually in this evolution. Okay, so now, how do I go about assigning tasks? And well, there are a couple of aspects that you need to take into consideration when you're assigning tasks. One of the aspects is specialization, which is the idea of making the tasks smaller and smaller. And the idea behind specialization is that as the task becomes smaller, you become more efficient at doing this task. You get better, right? So reasons to specialize will be efficiency, right? And also, there is an inherent uh, improvement in productivity that happens from not wasting time from moving from one thing to another, right? So if you're making a product from going to one task to another, you might require new tools, for example, right? If you're only conducting one task, you only need to stick to the tools you have. So you need to be shifting or moving parts or tools around. So that will make it inherently more efficient. Okay, and then finally, from a human resources perspective, another aspect that is going to happen as you specialize is that training gets easier, right? So now you can have modules that describe just this particular task that you're trying to complete, and because of that, training somebody into that position is going to become easier. Now, what is the downside of specialization? It sounds like everything is better if you just make the tasks smaller and more specific. The downside is people get bored, right? So over specialization can have actual negative implications within the firm. You could actually see in the beginning improvements in productivity, but over time, when people get essentially bored doing the same small task over and over again, and you will actually see decreases in productivity. So you need to balance specialization and fulfillment within the job place. And as organizations get bigger, another aspect that we observe within uh, assignment of tasks within organizations is this idea of departmentalization, which is essentially the creation of these groups that try to fulfill a similar task. So you can have groups that will be called departments, and that's the term departmentalization arises, but also it could be units or maybe divisions, and they all have this shared uh, task or shared mission within them that make them similar, right? And you can departmentalize by different aspects. It could be by function, it could be by the product or service that is provided. Geography is another variable that you can departmentalize on, and even customer. Let's just talk a little bit more in detail in the next slides about this. So here you have an example of departmentalization by function, which is one of the most common type of departments that exist within organizations. And a typical organigram that describes how the tasks are assigned within a firm, if it's functionally departmentalized, will look like this. So you'll have some sort of manager, in this case the president, at the helm, right, at the higher levels of management, and then you're going to observe different departments that are going to be right under them. Okay, and here we have, for example, production. This will be if it's a uh, product making company, and instead of production, if this was a service organization, it probably will be called operations, but it's kind of the same idea, right? And you also have marketing, right? Which is the communication with the customer of the different benefits of the product, right, through maybe advertising, etc. We'll talk more about it as we go along. Then you might also have a finance department, right, which is the part of the company that deals with money, right? We're going to have also maybe distribution, right, or logistics in firms where you basically outline all the processes for getting those products or services to the consumer, right, or your customer. And maybe you also have a research and development department that basically is the one that comes up with the technology and know-how that enables you to build the products and services that you do. So this will be a departmentalization that is based on the function that the different people fulfill within the organization. But this is the only way to organize people. Let's see another example. You can also departmentalize by product, right? By product. So, it is definitely conceivable that instead of organizing people by what function they fulfill, you could just have just people organized by the actual product or service that they develop. This is particularly true in large organizations. If there is only one product within the firm, obviously a product departmentalization makes no sense, right? So this is as the organization gets big enough, the tasks that are fulfilled on the different products might be so different that it will actually make sense to organize people by the kind of products that they are actually providing. So this is something that you observe in companies like General Electric, for example, that operates in very different markets. So General Electric has a set of products that are sold to typical consumers like you and me. So, for example, they make toasters and other appliances like fridges and dishwashers, right? On the other hand, General Electric also makes energy-related products. So they make generators. For example, they make nuclear power plants, right? So those products are very, 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 very different, right? The toaster is very different from a nuclear reactor. So because of that, it might actually make sense to organize the organization based on products instead of looking just at functions. Okay. Another way in which you can departmentalize, create a structure around is geography. This is particularly true when you're talking about global enterprise, right? So as the company gets larger and operates in more and more markets, it might make sense to actually create structure in the organization around those markets, right? So you can just look at the geography and say, okay, well, you know, most European countries behave in maybe similar ways, so they have similar legislations, and they happen to be close to each other. So because of that, we're going to group them all into the European division. Maybe the same thing happens with Latin America, and or maybe the same thing happens with the Middle East, etc. Right? So what we're doing is we are creating structure within the organization in a way that makes sense for the operations of the firm. Right? We've talked about function. Right? We've talked about products, but there could be enough variation within geography that it will actually make sense to create structure or departments around it. And finally, another aspect that you can use to create departments are customers. So it is conceivable, and it happens all the time, that firms have very different customers that they are serving. And because of that, it might make sense to organize the firm around those customers instead of functions or geography, etc. And a typical distinction will be industrial versus consumer uh, products, right? Because they operate differently, because it's not the same to deal with a final consumer that it is to deal with an organization or a company. Okay? And you can see this in a maybe more extreme sense in companies like Boeing, right? So Boeing makes planes for the most part and other aeronautical solutions, right? Like they also make satellites, etc. And but for the most part, a lot of their product portfolio is about planes. But those planes have different customers in mind. So you have uh, the traditional consumer uh, of Boeing, which will be airlines, right? But also the government buys planes from Boeing, right? So the government for the military, for example, will buy aeronautical solutions from Boeing. So Boeing is organized on their military side, which has the government, mostly of the U.S., but there are also other governments that buy from Boeing, obviously. And they have the government as their customer, and then you have the traditional civil planes, which uh, are actually bought by mostly airlines, although I guess you could have individual customers if they have sufficient enough money buying some of these planes, and this actually happens, right? So this distinction between different types of customers can be so different or dramatically uh, different that it will actually make sense to organize based on that. So one of the key aspects of why we have organizational structure is to assign authority to different people within the organization. So what is authority? It's essentially the ability to make a decision and take action within the organization, right? So not only we're going to provide or allocate tasks among the different employees, but we're going to give them the authority to make decisions when it comes down to some of the resources within the firm, right? So the idea behind authority is that you're going to have the responsibility to do certain tasks, but also with that responsibility is going to come the power to basically make some decisions and allocate some resources. Okay, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to give tasks to people, but then also empower them to be able to conduct those tasks, right? So if you're given a task, but you're not given any authority, you're going to be in a difficult place because you're not going to be able to make decisions about resources, whether it's time, people, or money within the organization that is going to enable you to do anything, right? So with authority, it's going to come accountability, right? So it's going to happen is you're going to be given the power to make decisions, and with that, you are going to become accountable for the results of these decisions. By the way, accountability can be of two types. It could be on process, that you follow procedures appropriately, right? Or it could be on outcomes, and they are very different, right? On on outcomes is, okay, we don't care what process you follow, we just care about the results, and that will be outcome based. Or accountability can be in process. Did you follow the procedures, and then whatever happened with the outcomes, and well, maybe we're not that worried about that. And it's gonna depend to which of these two accountability models you lean towards, depending on the environment. If there is a lot of uncertainty, people will look more at the process, because maybe the outcome doesn't depend only on what you did. Okay, it might depend on other things like external factors, right? On the other hand, if there is not a lot of uncertainty, uh, people will lean more towards outcomes. But for the most part, accountability will be measured both in process and outcomes within the organization. Okay. Now, when we keep thinking about how the organization structure, one of the critical aspects that we're going to be seeing is how centralized organization is. Meaning, how is authority delegated within the organization? If it's highly centralized, you're going to have most of the authority to make decisions about resources within the firm at the top of the firm. So it's going to be only a few people, a handful of people that are the ones that are making the calls and making the decisions about pretty much everything that happens within the organization. And those type of organizations are called centralized organizations, right? Because the power is centralized. On the other hand, if authority is spread throughout the organization and it comes down to the lower levels in the organization to make decisions, and then what you're going to talk about is the decentralized organization, okay, where authority is delegated far down the chain of the organization, maybe enabling people to make decisions that have closer interactions with the information that is necessary for making that decision. Okay, so the advantage of decentralizing is that as you move down the organization, the decision-making power, the people that are actually making the decisions have a more clear understanding of what the problem is. So as we're creating structure in the organization to assign responsibility and tasks, one of the aspects that we need to discuss is this concept of span of management, which is essentially the number of people that are under your authority, right? The number of subordinates that report particularly to one person or manager, okay? So whenever you hear the span of management, what you're talking about is how many people actually are going to be reporting directly to you, right? A wide span of management is when you have a large number of supervisees that are basically going to be reporting directly to you as a manager. So if you have a lot of people that you need to coordinate and direct, then you talk about a wide span of management. A narrow span of management, obviously, is the opposite. It's when you have a small number of direct supervisees that are actually uh, reporting back to you, right? Over which you have authority in assigning tasks, etc. Now, the counterpart of span of management is this idea of layers within the organization, right? This idea of chain of command, which is essentially um, how many different groups of managers are you going to see within the organizational structure, right? So you're going to see organizations that have many layers, right? And in organizations where there are many layers for the same number of employees, you're going to have a narrow span of management. And this obviously follows because you have the same amount of people, but you have more layers, more managers intertwined between those layers. Each manager is essentially going to have less people reporting directly to them. We'll see that in a diagram later. And the opposite happens when you have few layers, right? When you have few layers within an organization, what's going to happen is you're going to have wide span of management. If the same number of employees are reporting to only one layer, you can see it here, right? Here you have only one layer of management, right? So in this situation, what we have is we have everybody reporting to only one person, right? So it's a very flat organization. We talk about flat because, you know, the distance between the top and the bottom is small, so it's pretty flat. Okay, and in this case, span of management is wide, right? There's a lot of people reporting to only one manager. On the other hand, here you have a tall organization, right, where there are many layers. In this case, we have two layers in between that didn't exist over here. Okay, and as you have more layers to each manager, there are fewer and fewer people that are reporting to them. So you can see here the average span of management is 2 actually, right? Because for every manager you just have 2 people reporting back to them. Okay, whereas here we had 5, right? So this is a narrower span of management. So when you have a tall organization like this, you know, span of management gets smaller. So if you have a huge organization, you're going to see taller and taller structures so that you can actually enable a large organization, because obviously one person cannot be supervising thousands of individuals, right? So as the organization gets bigger and bigger, what's going to happen is the organizational structure is going to get taller. Okay? Now, what kind of forms of organizational structures are we going to see? And we were discussing the organigram that, you know, depicts how those jobs are organized. Then what we need to understand is what those lines mean. So you're going to have the simplest case, which is a line structure. That's where basically the lines that you see in the organigram, what they are doing is they are depicting direct lines of authority uh, between managers. So whenever you see a line between two boxes in a line structure situation, what that means is that the person on top, or the position on top, has authority in determining the tasks that the people at the bottom need to do, and also there's going to be direct reporting, right? So it's going to have to be a communication that is going to happen both ways. We'll talk about communication more later. And as the company gets bigger, what you're going to see is you're going to move to just having a line structure to also have line and staff structure. Now, staff is going to be specialized positions that support some of the positions within the organization, but don't have direct lines of authority over it. So let me show you an example in the next slide. So here you can see line structure. This will be a very simple organization where, you know, you have at the top of the organization the owner, right? And then, you know, there might be a manager that is in charge of maybe the convenience store in this case, right? Then maybe if the store is large enough, you might have an assistant manager, right? And then finally, you might have some employees here at the bottom, right, that report to this assistant manager, right? This is a line structure, right, where there is a direct connection and authority from the top to the bottom, right? And the tasks are assigned, etc., etc. Now, here you have line and stuff. Line and stuff's a little bit different, right? Now we don't only have different lines of authority, which you can see here with a solid line in the diagram, but you also have staff positions, right? So here you have staff positions, for example, human resources, right? And this is done like this in many organizations. Oftentimes, human resources doesn't have direct authority over, for example, a production manager, but they provide support to the production manager. Okay, so for example, if the production manager needs to hire somebody, they're going to go back to their human resource department and get some help in that task. But human resources usually does not have direct authority over the production manager. So they are going to be different functions that are relating to each other differently. And you can see the staff positions in this case in the diagram, they are captured by this dashed line instead of a solid line. Now, let's continue talking about the different forms of organizational structure. You're going to see as the firms get bigger that they are going to create more complex structures that enable them to basically deal with the uncertainty that the size it's creating. So you're going to have first multidivisional structures, and that's when you have large organizations or large firms that instead of just maybe only being organized by function, which is a very typical thing, right? We were talking about departments that are based on functions, like marketing, finance, etc. Now what you're going to do is you're going to create divisions, right? And a division could be organized around geography, for example. So you could have a division that deals with America, another division that deals with Europe, right? So you will have, you know, these two large divisions within the firm to keep the example simple. And then what's going to happen is within each of the division, you're going to have the different functions, right? So you still will have marketing, a marketing function, a finance function, maybe an operations function for Europe, and the same three will also exist for America, right? Now, what this enables you to do is it enables you to maybe make decisions better within these different divisions, right? So maybe it could be that, you know, things that are happening in Europe are not actually happening in America, right? In my example that I was providing before about the two divisions. So because of that, decision making is going to be working better if you create these divisions, because it basically enables delegation at, in this case, geographic level, that maybe will help making the decisions maybe better, maybe faster, right? Because information flow, etc. Now, what is the downside of creating this multidivisional structure in the firm? It's essentially this idea of duplication, right? So now we're going to have two marketing departments, right? One for one division and another one for the other. And the problem with duplication is that this is going to increase the cost for the organization, right? So you might be able to delegate authority better and make better decisions, but it comes at a cost. So you need to balance these two out. So this is a multidivisional structure, which is very commonly observed in large corporations. This is, I would say, the norm for really large enterprise. And then you have a more complex structure. It's called a matrix structure. And matrix structure arises when you have two or more intersecting lines of authority, right? At least two. You could have multidimensional matrices that more than two levels, but it gets exceedingly complex if you ask me. So what is the idea of a matrix structure? Is that you can basically account for more of the uncertainty within the organization by having two different ways of organizing the firm instead of only one. I'm going to show you in the next slide so that you can see it. Now, what is the downside of having two lines of authority? Is that, you know, it's expensive and complex, right? It creates a lot of difficulties sometimes within the firm, because now you're going to have two bosses for each manager, right? Because we're going to have two lines of authority. So let me show you how this looks like. This is a typical matrix structure, right? And the way this is organized, but it could be different ones, is we are organizing by function, right? And also we are organizing by project in this case. So you might have uh, functional managers. So it could be, for example, the first one, this could be marketing, this could be finance, this could be um, operations, and maybe this is human resources, right? So you have somebody who's in charge of all the marketing. They will be right here, okay? But on the other hand, there might be individual projects that are taking place that are so large and important that each of these projects are going to have their own manager that is just not specialized on a function but is in charge of that project. So anybody that works right here, right, in the intersections, it's going to be reporting to both the functional manager and the project manager, which provides a lot of flexibility, because anything happens, you can just directly talk to the person in charge of either the project or the function. But on the other hand, there could be some conflict arising from this structure, right? Because the directions that you get from one manager and the other might actually be different. Okay, now within organizations, other than these large structures we've been talking about, like departments or divisions, you have smaller structures that are important too. And I want to particularly talk about teams and groups because you're going to work in teams and groups in pretty much every organization. You're already doing that even in this class, right? We have teams. And so let me make a distinction between a group and a team. A group is essentially when you have at least two individuals, right? Obviously, usually more than two, right? That do a couple things. One is they communicate, right? Communicate with each other, and they have shared identity and goals, right? So they have some common goal that they are trying to achieve, right? So that's what we're gonna call a group. At least two people that communicate with each other and they have shared identity and goal. Okay, now what is a team? A team is like a group, except that it tends not to be really large, right? So teams cannot be 40, 50 people. Okay, it gets difficult. So it's usually small. But most importantly, it has a common purpose and goal, same as the group, right? But they hold themselves accountable as a group for the decisions that they actually make. Okay, in the case of a group, you just have individual accountability. In the case of a team, the accountability is happening as a group, right? So if we fail, we all fail together. It's not somebody's fault. It's not, this guy did this or this guy did that. As a team, it's all together. Now, one of the things that you are seeing enabled by technology is that these teams are becoming very prevalent, even when you're working across boundaries and in long distance. So as you can see, this idea of virtual teams, we're going to be doing some practice on this semester because of the circumstances. We are going to be using technology to work together even though we are not physically in the same space, which is something that in the history we haven't been able to do as much as we can now because of information technology. So we're going to actually put these team issues to work during this term. And then a couple other types of structures that are typical in firms that maybe you relate less to because you haven't probably worked in large organizations yet are committees and task forces. What is a committee? Committee is a permanent group that performs a specific task, right? So you could have a committee that is in charge of uh, overseeing a certain task within the organization. So, for example, a committee for new product development, right? So this is a group of managers that what they do is they evaluate the process of new product creation within the organization, right? And it's a permanent group. It's something that's established, and then it's an ongoing task that doesn't just end, right? That will be a committee, right? A task force is different. It's different because it's temporary, right? It's a group of employees that are basically trying to do something within the organization, but that's going to have an end whenever that task is accomplished. So that's a task force, and it could be a group of people that are very similar in their function, or it could be very different. Same thing with geography, etc. Right? And the key thing is that we put people into task forces based on what they know what to do in their skill set, rather than where they are within the organization in terms of their authority. So the important aspect of task forces is that you have uh, the right expertise within the task force, the people that actually know how to do the things that they need to do instead of how hard they are within the organization. Okay, and remember, task forces are temporary. Okay. Let's discuss communication, which is one of the important aspects that is going to happen within the organization as a consequence of the structure that we have set up, right? So we're going to have different types of communication within the different layers of the organization. So we're going to have upwards communication, which is the one that happens between lower levels of the organization and upper levels of the organization. So here you have a vice president, for example, maybe reporting to a CEO, right? So that will be upward communication. Whether it's upwards or downwards is a function of authority, right? Where you are within the organizational structure, right? When it's moving from lower levels to upper levels, we call it upwards. When it's moving from upper levels to lower levels, we call it downwards, right? And you can also have horizontal communication, of course, which will be, for example, when somebody within the marketing department is talking to somebody within the accounting department, right? They are not necessarily at different levels in the organization. They just are passing flow of information from one to another, and they are essentially at the same level in the organization. Again, that will be horizontal communication. Okay. And diagonal communication is similar to when we were discussing upwards and downwards. That's when you are at two different levels of the organization, right? When it's from a higher one to a lower one. Okay. Now, this communication can be of two types. It could be formal, where basically you have a priori established given processes that need to actually happen for different things within the organization. So, for example, you might have a monthly report that you need to complete for your manager, right? So every month you're gonna maybe discuss sales and different activities within the organization just to see where you guys stand. That will be a type of formal communication that you're going to engage in every month in this case. So it could be weekly, it could be daily, right? It really doesn't matter. So it's intentionally defined and it's designed by the organization, right? So you know exactly what you need to do, when you need to do it, and what needs to be part of the conversation that is going to take place. But there is also informal communication within the firm, right? And it's something that is going to happen organically, naturally, right? There's going to be people that get along better with each other, and because of that, they talk. They talk both within the organization and maybe also outside the organization about work-related issues, right? And one of the most important aspects is the grapevine, right? Which is basically this organic communication that happens within the organization that it's not sanctioned. And communication is one of the most central aspects within the organization for better decision making. So the flow of information needs to be constant, and all the relevant information should be actually used for all decisions. So because of that, you want to try to improve as much as you can the communication process and effectiveness within the firm. How are you going to do that? First, most importantly, is try to encourage feedback. Right? Why? Because most people do a lot more listening than they do talking. And when I say talking, it could be just an email or a telephone conversation. It doesn't have to be person to person. So because of that, you need to provide opportunities for getting feedback about what's happening within the organization, right? And so feedback is absolutely essential. And it's particularly important to encourage negative or maybe not so positive aspects of feedback, just to make sure that we catch the problems before they get too big, right? And how do we also do this? By encouraging listening, right? Especially from the manager side, right? So whenever you are have authority over somebody else, uh, it's very, very important to listen to what that feedback is, right? And to that, it's important to avoid interruption, right? Of all types, but definitely when somebody's bringing up a grievance or a difficulty within the organization, you should make sure that that is actually encouraged and listened to. Again, because if you do not have a strong communications within the organization, the work is not going to get done properly. Communication is one of the most central things. we want to make sure that people are productive and things are getting done, you need to make sure that people know A, what is expected of them, so communication is central doing this, and B, what's working and what's not working, right? So we really need to make sure that we encourage communication, we set up the right channels for this communication to happen, sometimes more than duplicate channels, right? To make sure that we give enough opportunities. We want to encourage feedback.